is seeing historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
When Florida announced its plan to release predators into the wild, the world laughed. It sounded reckless, even dangerous. But behind the controversy was a science experiment born out of desperation. The Everglades were dying, and this was the last resort. What followed would test everything we thought we knew about nature's balance. Before we laugh too hard at Florida's gamble, maybe we should ask what kind of crisis forces people to make such a wild choice? What was happening that no one seemed to notice? Let's rewind to where it all began, the silent apocalypse. Long before this chaos began, the Florida Everglades looked like something out of a nature documentary. It was an endless green sawgrass stretched toward the horizon, broken only by the shimmer of shallow water. Here, birds soared overhead, raccoons scurried through the marshes, and bobcats stalked the edges of the brush. Life moved in balance, and every creature played its part in a system worth an estimated $31.5 billion each year. It was one of Earth's rare places where wild still meant wild because no one imagined that balance could unravel so quietly. Now, this story didn't begin with a bang. It started with a storm. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through southern Florida, flattening homes, ripping through communities, and destroying a reptile breeding facility near Miami. When the winds died, a few exotic snakes had escaped into the wetlands. At the same time, overwhelmed pet owners were releasing their once cute Burmese pythons into the wild, thinking they were setting them free. For years, no one paid much attention. Get these Burmese pythons out of the Florida Everglades. There were snakes here and there that seemed harmless, but they weren't. Those early sightings turned into something much darker. As the years passed, the population exploded. What had started as a few released pets became an invasion hiding in plain sight. Now, experts estimate anywhere from 100,000 to about 300,000 pythons slither through South Florida's swamps. During mating season, each female can lay close to 1,000 eggs. Once they are hidden in the undergrowth, they multiply faster than anyone could track or trap. And now, the Everglades, a paradise once bursting with wildlife, is falling silent. Also, devastating numbers started to evolve. Raccoon populations dropped by 99.3%. Opossums fell by 98.9%, and bobcats by 87.5%. Even marsh rabbits, which are always a common sight, have nearly vanished, and deer sightings have fallen by more than 90% in some areas. What the pythons didn't eat, they displaced. The balance that held the Everglades together was breaking apart. And the worst part? Almost no one noticed. Not until it was nearly too late. Now we begin to think, why exactly were these snakes unstoppable? Because in Florida, every element of the environment seemed designed to help them thrive. The heat, the humidity, and the endless food supply created a perfect home. With no natural predators to keep them in check, they thrived. Their camouflage made them ghosts in the grass and nearly impossible to spot. For scientists, it was like fighting an invisible enemy. Each snake removed seemed to be replaced by 10 more. The invaders had found heaven and they were consuming it. To top it all, these weren't ordinary snakes. They were apex predators capable of swallowing a deer whole. Some grew over 20 feet long and weighed more than 200 pounds. Then, videos of pythons battling with alligators started surfacing, shocking the world. In a food web once ruled by native predators, the python had taken the throne. What once symbolized Florida's wild beauty was now turning into a battlefield, and nature was losing badly. Even so, the economic and ecological stakes went far beyond wildlife. The Everglades, with its $31.5 billion ecosystem value, supports tourism, fishing, and flood control for millions. Yet every year, the python threat grew. Researchers and hunters have captured over 23,000 snakes, but that's barely 1% of what's out there. The rest remain unseen, silently breeding, spreading, and devouring. And the swamp that once pulsed with life now echoes with absence. And as officials searched for solutions, nothing seemed to work. The ecosystem was collapsing from within. And the laughter over Florida's crazy idea to fight back would soon turn into silence. The real joke was that while everyone mocked the plan, the apocalypse had already arrived. It wasn't loud or fiery, it was quiet, creeping, and all too real. For years, people believed there had to be a way to take the Everglades back. What came next proved how wrong that hope was. Desperation and failure. At first, Florida's response to the python invasion looked like something out of an adventure film. Officials opened the gates to hunters, scientists, and anyone brave enough to wade through miles of swamp in search of the slithering invaders. In 2013, a 10-day event called the Florida Python Challenge that sounded both daring and desperate evolved. Basically, hundreds of people showed up armed with traps, hooks, and nerves of steel, ready to do what decades of policy couldn't. By 2024, it had become an annual spectacle. That year alone, 857 participants from all across the US and even Canada showed up to take on the Everglades' most notorious residents. They captured 195 Burmese pythons, capturing headlines and a round of applause from the public. The winner walked away with a $10,000 grand prize, hailed as a hero in the fight to save Florida's wild heart. For a moment, it felt like victory might finally be within reach. But as it turned out, the numbers hid a darker truth. A year later, the 2025 competition broke new records. The top hunter, Taylor Stanberry, caught about 60 pythons. This was literally the highest total in the event's history. Altogether, participants pulled out 294 snakes, a figure that sounded huge until you realized how small it really was, compared to the estimated tens of thousands still slithering free. The Everglades wasn't healing, it was gasping, and the pythons were multiplying faster than anyone could count. To make up for the shortfall, the state brought in professionals. The South Florida Water Management District hired 24 elite hunters paid hourly to stalk the swamps year-round. These weren't weekend adventurers, they were career python chasers armed with everything science could offer. Still, the snakes always seemed one step ahead. So Florida tried something new, which was high-tech warfare. Engineers designed robotic robots that gave off heat and scent to trick pythons into striking. Dog teams were trained to sniff out reptile scent trails. Drones hovered above the wetlands scanning for movement, and wildlife biologists even attached GPS collars to raccoons and possums to track where predators might be lurking. Some of the boldest experiments involved using scout snakes fitted with tiny radio transmitters to lead researchers to hidden breeding females. It was an ecological chess game, one humans were determined to win. Yet, the harder they fought, the faster the snakes seemed to spread. Since 2017, contractors have removed over 23,000 pythons from the wild. It sounds exceptional until you learn that experts believe that's less than 1% of the total population. Even massive removal campaigns barely made a dent. Every time a hunter pulled one out, dozens more hatched somewhere else. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The frustration was hard to hide. Years of effort, billions in funding, and an endless list of experiments had led to the same sobering truth, that the pythons weren't going anywhere. The best anyone could do was slow them down. Scientists began admitting publicly what many had quietly feared, which was that full eradication is impossible. These predators had claimed the Everglades as their own, and no one had figured out how to take it back. Each failed attempt deepened the sense of helplessness. Hunters waded deeper into the marshes, drones flew higher, and technology got smarter, but the snakes adapted faster. They slithered north into new habitats, ignoring boundaries humans had drawn. Every solution seemed to end in the same place, a dead end. This growing sense of defeat pushed Florida to the edge. If technology, money, and manpower couldn't stop them, what could? Somewhere in that frustration, a wild idea began to take shape, and scientists faced an impossible question. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, can't catch, and can't kill fast enough? The twisted gift from pythons. What if Florida's biggest problem wasn't the pythons slithering through the swamps, but something much smaller hiding inside them? You see, deep in the Everglades, a silent passenger arrived with the invaders, an unseen parasite that's now rewriting the state's ecological story. Its name is Rattalella orientalis, better known as the snake lungworm. And while the pythons grab attention from everyone normally, this parasite is quietly bringing an entirely new kind of chaos. It all started with a hitchhiker no one could see. The lungworm originally came from Asia, tagging along with Burmese pythons before they found their way into Florida's wild. Once the snakes settled in, the parasite slipped into the local food chain, like it had been waiting for the moment. Firstly, the python's droppings carried the worm's eggs into the swamp. Next, cockroaches fed on the waste, and lastly, lizards and frogs ate the roaches. Then, when native snakes went after those smaller prey, they swallowed the real threat without ever knowing it. Inside the snake's body, the larvae began their journey. They tunneled through the stomach and moved into the lungs where they grew and fed. For many native snakes, especially smaller ones, this infection is brutal. The worms feed on blood and tissue, slowly choking the animal from the inside. Breathing becomes a struggle, energy fades, and some snakes simply starve to death because they can't hunt anymore. Researchers have found snakes suffering from pneumonia, open lung lesions, and in some cases, dozens of worms crawling out through the mouth. It's not something you forget once you've seen it. The real shock came when scientists discovered how far the lungworm had spread. 18 native snake species in Florida have already been infected, and the parasite's reach now stretches through dozens of counties. Some reports say as far north as Jacksonville and even toward the Panhandle. The pythons may have started this, but the lungworm isn't waiting for them anymore. It's moving through Florida's native snakes on its own, and that's the terrifying part. When native snakes die, the balance collapses. Rodents multiply, small predators lose their food source, and the ripple effect shakes entire ecosystems. These snakes are more than background players. They're pest control, prey, and predator all in one. Scientists fear that even if every python were removed tomorrow, the lungworm would still remain. It's here, alive and thriving in the very species meant to keep Florida's wild in balance. Florida is deploying robotic rabbits to help capture invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades. However, there's one strange twist to this story. The Florida cottonmouth, a native pit viper, seems to resist the parasite's attack. No one knows why. Is it genetics, diet, and natural immunity developed over time? Whatever the reason, it's one of the few hopeful mysteries in an otherwise grim picture. What began as a battle against giant snakes has turned into something far more complicated. An invisible invader is now spreading faster than the predator that brought it here. No cure, no treatment, and no clear way to stop it. Each infected snake means more parasites released into the wild, and every death leaves the ecosystem weaker. Florida's war against pythons was already tough. Now it's fighting an enemy too small to see and one that's not going anywhere. The state thought it was dealing with a predator problem. Instead, it might be watching the slow birth of an entirely new plague. The deeper the crisis grew, the wilder the ideas became, and one plan in particular pushed the limits of belief. The laughable plan. When the news broke, it sounded like something straight out of a late-night comedy sketch. Florida officials announced they were releasing hundreds of eastern indigo snakes, a native non-venomous species, into the wild to help fight the state's invasive python crisis. The headline alone triggered a storm. Within hours, social media was flooded with jokes, memes, and disbelief. This is the 9th year state agencies have released eastern indigo snakes back into the wild in the Florida Panhandle. Doesn't Florida have enough snakes already? Fighting snakes with more snakes? What could go wrong? Others compared it to the mongoose disaster in Hawaii, where an attempt to fix one problem ended up creating a bigger one. For many Floridians, it sounded like another episode in the state's long history of strange wildlife decisions. News outlets quickly picked up the frenzy. Some ran headlines that made it sound like a sci-fi movie. Talk shows turned the announcement into punchlines, while anxious residents asked if their pets and children were safe. Even a few wildlife enthusiasts raised eyebrows, questioning if the state had lost its mind. Skepticism spread faster than the snakes ever could. Why would anyone think adding more serpents was the solution? To the average person, it felt absurd, more like a plan doomed before it started. Even a few conservationists hesitated to defend it publicly. After all, the optics weren't great. Florida had spent years trying to kill snakes, and now it was releasing them. The contradictions made the plan an easy target for mockery. What few people realized, though, was that the eastern indigo snake wasn't the villain of the story. It had been the missing hero all along. Once common throughout the southeast, the indigo snake had nearly vanished due to habitat loss and overcollection. Yet this species held something no one could ignore. It was nature's own python hunter. The indigo eats other snakes, including venomous ones, and it does so without fear. Behind the laughter and headlines, scientists had been quietly working for years on bringing this native predator back. Teams from conservation organizations and wildlife agencies had been breeding indigos in captivity, restoring their habitats, and preparing for a careful reintroduction. What looked impulsive to the public was actually a plan decades in the making. Still, the timing couldn't have been worse. Florida's reputation for oddball decisions made it easy for people to assume this was another mistake waiting to happen. What no one knew was that behind all that noise was a rare glimpse of an old idea resurfacing, using balance, not bullets, to fix what humans had broken. The indigo's return wasn't about chaos, it was about restoration. While critics rolled their eyes, scientists saw something different, which is a chance to bring back a predator that once ruled the ecosystem before the python invasion ever began. They knew it would take patience, not panic, to see results. The laughter was loud, but the truth behind the plan was louder still. Florida wasn't acting out of desperation. It was taking a calculated step toward rebalancing a broken wilderness. And as the mockery faded, one question lingered in the air. Could the answer to Florida's biggest ecological nightmare really come from another snake? Well, keep watching to find out. Meet the Emperor. Deep in the pine forests of the American Southeast, a silent ruler once moved through the undergrowth. Only a few ever saw it, yet its presence shaped the land in quiet, commanding ways. The eastern indigo snake earned the nickname Emperor of the Forest, and for good reason. The eastern indigo snake was long, graceful, and utterly fearless. Growing up to 9 feet, it could glide through tall grass or disappear into sandy burrows with an ease that left even seasoned hunters speechless. Its scales shimmered with shades of blue and black, catching light in a way that made it look almost alive with color. Around its throat, a soft coral tint marked it as something rare, a predator with the calm confidence of a king. Unlike many snakes, this one didn't rely on venom or brute strength to rule. The eastern indigo was non-venomous and surprisingly gentle toward people, but in its world, it was the undisputed top predator. It ate almost anything that moved, including birds, rodents, frogs, lizards, turtle eggs, and other snakes, whether or not they were venomous. The indigo was immune to rattlesnake venom, and it didn't bother constricting its prey. It would pin it down or swallow it alive, unshaken by the struggle. Once, a researcher discovered a single indigo that had eaten a pygmy rattlesnake, a tortoise hatchling, and a hognose snake, all in one sitting. It basically showed that this quiet giant didn't need to roar to prove its power. Its kingdom, however, was once vast. From the rolling hills of Virginia to the wetlands of Florida and as far west as Mississippi, the eastern indigo reigned across nearly 90 million acres. It thrived in longleaf pine forests, oak hammocks, and the sandy ridges of the south. But that kingdom began to crumble when forests fell to logging and farming. And by the late 20th century, nearly 97% of its habitat was gone. In 1978, the U.S. government listed the species as threatened. The emperor's reign had been reduced to fragments, mostly in Florida and small pockets of Georgia. The fall wasn't caused by nature alone. People collected them for the pet trade, and during rattlesnake roundups, hunters pumped poison gas into gopher tortoise burrows to drive out rattlesnakes, and the indigos hiding there never stood a chance. During the Great Depression, when meat was scarce, people dug up tortoises for food and killed the snakes they found with them. Piece by piece, the indigo's world was stripped away until only a few isolated groups remained. Each loss of forest or tortoise burrow was like another brick pulled from the foundation of an ancient fortress. What made this story even more tragic was how deeply the indigo's fate was tied to that of the gopher tortoise. These snakes use the tortoise's burrows for nearly everything, like shelter, nesting, and protection from the cold. Over 350 other species also depend on those burrows, making them one of the South's most vital habitats. So when tortoises declined, the indigos followed. The two species were bound together by survival itself, each one quietly shaping an entire ecosystem that few people ever noticed was disappearing. Snakes are beautiful, and indigo snakes love to eat venomous snakes, which helps keep the ecosystem in balance. And yet, despite near extinction and fewer than 50 known breeding populations remaining at one point, the eastern indigo snake held something extraordinary. It had one trait that could make it more than a relic of the past. It was a natural-born snake hunter, unafraid of venom, unafraid of size. In a region now struggling against invasive pythons, that could mean everything. The emperor's story isn't over. It stands at a crossroads between what once was and what might be restored. It carries the memory of ancient forests and the promise of a balance that could return. As the plan to reintroduce it takes off, one question looms. Can the emperor reclaim its throne and tip the balance? Nature fights back. For nearly 20 years, the Burmese python ruled Florida's wildlands without challenge. The Everglades, once alive with rabbits, raccoons, and deer, had fallen silent under the weight of this giant predator. Every study painted the same bleak picture about native species disappearing, food chains collapsing, and the balance of nature tilting toward chaos. However, one December morning, deep in the wetlands, the story took a shocking turn. Researchers tracking a 13-foot, 52-pound male python named Loki expected a routine update. The snake had been fitted with a GPS tracker as part of a breeding study, and scientists believed he was closing in on a female. What they found instead left them speechless. Loki's body was sprawled in the grass. His massive head was chewed off and hidden under a bed of pine needles. Nobody could pinpoint what exactly had happened. However, a few days later, a trail camera revealed the unlikely culprit, and it was not what anyone expected. A creature, which was a bobcat weighing barely 25 pounds, had taken down a predator more than twice its size. This discovery stunned everyone. Wildlife experts called it a first in Florida's history, where a native bobcat ended an adult Burmese python. For years, these pythons had been the apex hunters, feared by everything around them. Now, suddenly, one of Florida's own had turned the tables. Some speculated that the cold snap had slowed the python, making it vulnerable. Others suggested the bobcat had learned something new, that these enormous snakes could be prey. Whatever the reason, the message was clear that the Everglades were beginning to fight back. And this wasn't an isolated story. Across Florida, cameras and field reports started revealing more evidence of nature adopting. Alligators have been spotted eating smaller pythons, and wildlife footage shows eastern indigo snakes, those same snake hunters once mocked by the public, consuming juvenile Burmese pythons. Even the elusive Florida panther has been documented taking on these invaders. These scenes are rare, but they show that Florida's native predators are learning to challenge the newcomers that once terrified them. The Burmese python has lived in Florida for decades, but aren't native to the area. These things will take out a deer. I mean, it's unbelievable what they're able to do. For years, the pythons seemed unstoppable. They had no natural predators, reproduced in staggering numbers, and wiped out entire animal populations. They became symbols of imbalance, proof of what happens when nature is pushed too far. So, when a bobcat, an alligator, or an indigo snake strikes back, it's more than an act of survival. It's a sign that the system itself is starting to recover its strength. One wildlife biologist put it best: it's a score for the home team. The Everglades are fighting back. Still, recovery doesn't happen overnight. A single bobcat can't undo 2 decades of destruction, and one indigo snake can't erase the damage of thousands of breeding pythons. For every invasive snake killed, dozens more hatch somewhere in the swamp. It's a slow war, measured not in victories, but in small, hard-earned shifts in balance. Even so, each act of resistance matters. Every native predator that learns, adapts, and passes that behavior forward is rewriting Florida's ecological story. The signs are hopeful, yet fragile. Scientists know that adaptation takes time, and time is something Florida's wildlife doesn't always have. Still, for the first time in years, there's proof that the fight isn't one-sided anymore. Nature is responding in the only way it knows, through instinct, adaptation, and quiet defiance. For 2 decades, pythons dominated. Now, Florida's natives were striking back. But was it enough? And what about those released indigos? The miracle. In the autumn of 2023, something extraordinary happened in Florida's longleaf pine sands at the Ecological Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. Trail cameras captured 2 wild-born hatchlings of the eastern indigo snake, offspring of previously released individuals. For the first time in nearly half a century, the indigo snake had reproduced in the wild in North Florida. It wasn't survival anymore. It was revival. For years, scientists had done everything possible to keep the dream alive. They bred snakes in captivity, tracked their movements, checked burrows, and hoped nature would take over. Still, progress felt fragile, like holding something too delicate to breathe on. And that changed the moment those hatchlings appeared. When biologists confirmed that one of the young snakes wasn't tagged, meaning it was born outside of human help, it proved the project was working. The indigos weren't simply hanging on, they were living, hunting, and raising the next generation in their own habitat again. It was the kind of moment that made years of quiet work worth it. As 2024 turned into 2025, the story kept growing. Teams began spotting more. You have to rebuild the system piece by piece until it can heal itself. But even as the cameras keep catching new life in motion, can this fragile success grow strong enough to last? And can the indigos establish a population that doesn't need human help anymore? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.